It's really wonderful to spend this time, and congratulations, Doyan. What you've built in these 5 years cannot be was not easy for you, I can imagine, because unfortunately, in this society that we've all sort of chosen to build our lives in, either voluntarily because you came here, you made the choice to immigrate, or non-voluntarily, you came here because somebody else, maybe a partner, a spouse, made the choice to come here. Being suddenly a minority, being suddenly someone who doesn't speak the language as fluently as you feel comfortable, suddenly having people question you for many different reasons, just because of the way that you look or the accent, all of that weighs very heavily on your ability to remain confident, to believe in yourself as well. And so I really, congratulations again, Doyan, for what you've built, and congratulations to all of you for making the choice to really actively do something to help yourself, empower yourself to find a path forward. And so when Doyan and I were talking about what she wanted to share, she just said, she reached out to me, she said, there are very few people like you anywhere, and a Korean American woman as a C-suite executive in a large tech company doesn't really exist in many places. And on top of that, in my specific field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are, again, almost no Asian people, certainly very few Korean people in the field. And so she simply said, like, I would love for you to share with this population a little bit of the journey that I went through to get here. And so I should start off by saying that I was born in Korea. I was actually born in Jeonju. My family immigrated to the United States in 1978 when I was 2 years old. So primarily raised in the United States, but my grandmother, my Harmony, immigrated with us and she raised us, and Harmony didn't speak any English. She didn't cook any American food. She didn't know anything other than being a Korean Harmony. So she raised us very Korean. And so the little bit of Korean that I know and the fact that I can pronounce most things okay is a result of her impact on my life. And so growing up, I grew up in a very bicultural world. Home life was very, very, very Korean. I also went to a very Korean 교회 growing up. So I had a lot of the social hierarchy of Korean society taught to me through that church experience. And then, of course, my life in school, my life outside of the home and church was very, very, very American. And so a lot of you wonder, like, should I call her Boyoung? Should I call her Bo? What is her actual name? And what I always tell people is my Korean identity is Boyoung, and the only people in my life who really call me Boyoung are Korean people. And I like it when Korean people call me Boyoung because they can actually pronounce it correctly. But then my American persona is Bo. It's still Korean, but it's simple for Western people to say it, and they don't mess up the pronunciation as much as Boyoung. I've gotten everything when people have tried to. One of the really funny things about having a very ethnic name, Korean name, is that people look at my name and it's in an English context, it's very phonetical. It's Bo Young Lee. I've had people look at my name and go, Bop Young. Is there a Bop Young? Bu Ying? Bu Ying? Ying Bu? Like, I had people just like look at my name and come up with every imaginable pronunciation that you can possibly imagine. And I'm like, it's Bo, as in Bo Derek and Bo Jackson. It's Young, like youth, and it's Lee, like Robert E. Lee. All parts of my name are actually English names in and of themselves, or English words, but somehow put together, they suddenly become very foreign and weird and unacceptable. And I think that's the reality of being a minority in the United States and for having a strange name. And if you speak with an accent, having an accented way of speaking English, or non-American accented, because American is in and of itself an accent. And so all my life, and in 1978, growing up in the United States, there were, I looked up the statistic, and in 1985, there were fewer than 400,000 Korean Americans in all of the United States. In 1978, there were about 150,000 Koreans in all of the United States. So I didn't really, other than the Kyoe I grew up in, like there were very few Koreans in the schools I grew up in. And so it was navigating this space very much alone. And because my parents were first generation immigrants, they worked all the time and they didn't understand American culture any more than I did. There was no one really there to help me kind of navigate my path forward. And there were no role models. There were no Korean people or Asian people on television. I never had a Korean teacher my entire life, you know, in public school or even in university. I never saw an Asian person, let alone an Asian woman being a leader. So throughout my life, I've always had to figure out, what am I going to do? Because I'm the first one that I know doing this. So whether it was, you know, figuring out when my kindergarten teacher, when I was 5 years old, and she looked at my name, and she was this old, lovely Jewish woman, but she looked at my name going, I can't say that. And then she looks at me, she goes, what do you want to be called? And I'm like, I don't know, I'm 5. And she goes, well, I'm just going to call you Bo. And I go, okay. You know, just making this up on the spot. To when I had to apply to high school in New York City, my parents had no idea how to apply to high school. So I had to figure out how to apply to high school. I had to go get the paperwork. I had to ask them for a check. I had to tell them how much money to, what amount I had to make the check out to, who I had to make it out to. All of those things I had to kind of figure out on my own. And then when I applied to university, they couldn't help me either. All my parents did was hand me a check and ask me how much the check should be. Everything else, from getting guidance counselor letters, getting letters of recommendations, writing my essays, even selecting which colleges to apply to, universities to apply to, I did very much on my own. And every time I would make a decision, I always remember thinking to myself, I really hope I'm making the right decision. I really have no idea what I'm doing. And luckily, in hindsight, now that I'm 46 years old, I think I did make the right decisions. But at the time, I had no idea what I was doing. Now, one thing you should understand about me is not only did I have to really navigate a lot of things in the American world by myself, the other thing that I had to really navigate was I was born with a personality and a disposition that no Korean parent wants. So what do I mean by that? Every parent loves a child that they could brag about. We all know this. You go to church and you're like, my kid got this, and my kid's like this, and this is what you do. You all want that 자랑스러운 child, right? And you also want a child who's very 착해. Those are the two things that you want in your children as Korean parents. I remember I was neither of those things. I was not 착해. I was born, my mother said, you were born screaming and yelling, and you stayed that way for your entire childhood. She goes, from the moment you came out, you were opinionated, stubborn, independent, loud, obnoxious, and you always wanted to get your way. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds about right, because I'm still kind of that way. But my parents wanted a good, quiet daughter, and that was not what they were given. And they just didn't know how to control me. And now that I'm an adult, if I could have gone back to them when I was little, I would have said, don't try to control me. That's the best way to actually calm me down, is don't try to control me. Let me kind of figure out my own path. So I was growing up in these worlds where, one, the American world was very much a mystery to me, and I had to figure out how to navigate it. But also the Korean world that I was growing up in, it wasn't a mystery to me. I understood it, but it felt very foreign to me. I knew inherently that I didn't fit in, that I wasn't like the other Korean kids around me, that I didn't like I remember like Korea is a very lookism culture. It was back then, it is even more so now. People care about how nicely your hair is combed. They care about, you know, how nicely your children are dressed. They, you know, how light your skin is, how pretty you are, how thin you are. All of those things mattered, especially for a little girl. I didn't want to do any of that. I still don't want to do any of that. If any of you can tell, I have a lot of gray hair. I am arguably one of the most successful Korean American women in the United States. My mother still to this day tells me, I'm 46 years old, she is 78 years old. My mother says, you know, if you colored your hair, you'd probably do better at work. And I tell my mother all the time, I don't think I actually could do better at work because I'm already doing really, really well at work. But she's convinced that if I color my hair and also if I were to fix this gap in my teeth, I would be more successful at work. But I just didn't care about those things. I don't care about those things now. I didn't care about those things as a child. So I always grew up kind of feeling like an outsider, both in the Korean world I lived in, but also the American world I lived in. And so the thing about me, you can imagine that kind of having that sense of isolation and that aloneness could have made me a very depressed child. But it didn't, because one of the things is, even though I was obnoxious and stubborn and all those kinds of things, I think I was born with one of the biggest privileges of my life. And that was an incredible sense of self-confidence and awareness of self. I always just kind of liked myself. I never thought I was the problem. The rest of the world is the problem. The rest of the world is problematic because they didn't think that I was pretty enough, or that I was quiet enough, or that I was obedient enough, or that I was not American enough, or that I was not Korean enough. Like, it's the rest of the world's problem. I felt really fine about who I was. And when people and the other part of me, that's like one of the greatest privileges, is that when someone tells me I can't do something, rather than getting depressed, I got angry. And then I would get angry, and then I would get very motivated to prove them wrong. And because I was an outsider, but also I kind of loved myself my whole life, never really questioned myself, I grew up always making my own choices, right? So I have two other sisters, and my parents didn't want us to go far away for university. So both my sisters made the choice to stay in New York and go to Columbia. When I went to school, I got into Columbia and I got into Cornell and I got into schools that were very close to home. And then I told my parents, I'm going to go to the University of Michigan because I need to go far, far away from home. And my parents were like, and I said, oh, and by the way, I got a full ride scholarship, so you don't have to actually pay any money, versus going to Columbia where you'd have to pay a lot of money for me to go. I said, and they were like, they weren't sure if they should say okay, but then they were like, oh, it's free. And they didn't really give me permission. They kind of just accepted the fact that I was going to go to University of Michigan. And then my parents, by that point in time, by the age of 18, they kind of had figured out I can't tell her what to do. They never actually told me you should study medicine, or you should study engineering, or you should study math. They never told me any of that. They actually never told me what to study. So they figured out that I would just figure it out on my own. And honestly, when I went to university, I had gone into university fully intending to become an academic. I had studied economics and psychology, and I had planned to get my PhD in behavioral economics and live a life of academics. Fast forward 4 years, I had a really good education. I applied to PhD programs. I got into a really good PhD program at MIT. So I was like on my path to becoming an academic. And then suddenly I told my parents I was going to get my PhD, and they finally had something that they could go to church and tell all the church people, our daughter got into MIT. And I think they did tell all of them that I got into MIT and that I was going to get my PhD. And then suddenly, like during my senior year, after I got my acceptance, I decided that I didn't want to become an academic after spending 4 years trying to like get into this program. But I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I dropped out. I didn't tell my parents immediately. I dropped out, and then I still didn't know what I wanted to do. And I did what a lot of smart, highly educated, completely clueless young people did. I went and became a management consultant. So, which is anyone, people will tell you that they want to become a management consultant because that's their goal in life. And I always say, like, that's BS. You're doing it because you have no idea what else you want to be when you grow up. So I went and did that for about 4 years. But before I actually started my job in management consulting, and I was very lucky that even though all the recruiting had ended, somebody made a recommendation for me and I was able to get a job. So I wasn't homeless after college. But before I started my job, I asked, what's the very last start date that you have, which was kind of like end of September, October. And then I packed up all my things in Michigan, shipped them home to New York, flew home. And then I looked at my parents and say, I have an airplane ticket. I'm flying to London. I'm going to be in Europe and Eastern Europe and Northern Africa for 4 months. I'm coming back, and then I'm going to start my job in like 2 days after I come back. And my parents looked at me and they're like, and this was before cell phones existed. This is like before anything. And they're like, what's your plan? I was like, I'm going to fly to London and I have some reservations at a youth hostel. And I have a flight back home from London on this date. They're like, what's going to happen in between? I'm like, we'll figure it out. So my parents were like, okay, our daughter's going to die. And Korean culture being what Korean culture is, I have there's three of us, me and my 2 sisters, so we're 3 girls, but all my first cousins who live in America are all boys. So of course my parents call up my uncle and says, oh my God, our crazy daughter is doing something crazy. She's going to go to Europe for 4 months and she's going to die. And of course my male cousins were all like, oh, you have to stop her from going. She's going to get killed and all this kind of stuff. And so my parents come back and going, your boy cousins are telling you not to go because you're going to get killed. And I just looked at them. I'm like, they're cowards. They're just jealous that they didn't think of this and that they don't have the bravery. I'm going. And so I left. And now that I'm a parent, I have 2 children, 11 and 4. I think to myself all the time, I'm like, I was a terrible child. I probably gave my parents a heart attack every single day. And I think about the fact that when I was away for 4 months, I maybe called home once every 3 weeks, if I'm being super honest. And every time I called home, my parents were like, oh, 살았어. Like literally that was their first like reaction. They're like, she's alive. She's not dead. Because they spent, if you think about it, in between each call, I could have just died and disappeared off the face of the planet and they would never know. But I didn't. And in that period of time, I traveled from London to Amsterdam to Paris. I went, to Spain, Italy, Germany. I went all the way far to east. I went to, Poland and, the Czech Republic and Greece. And I then from Greece went down to Egypt and I went all across North Africa and I went to Morocco. And then from Morocco, I went back up to Spain and I just traveled probably covered 15 or 16 countries during that period of time. Sometimes I actually slept outside because I couldn't get a reservation in a hostel. I never told my parents that, and they will never know because that would still probably give my mother a heart attack if she knew that I was homeless for a night or 2 during my trip. Came back to the United States, worked as a management consultant for about 4 years. Liked the experience in some ways, hated the experience in many, many ways. Still didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. I was about 25 years old at that time, still clueless. And so I decided, what's the best thing to do when you're still clueless after working for 4 years and you're smart and ambitious? You go and get your MBA and spend 2 years asking yourself the question, what do I want to be when I grow up?